May 7th, 1945. A grand, half-ruined German mansion outside Frankfurt. American soldiers were celebrating in the courtyard, laughing, drinking, firing their rifles into the air with the wild joy of men who had survived the worst war in history. The Third Reich had fallen. The war in Europe was over. But inside, in a quiet room beneath a crumbling chandelier, two men who had helped save the world were not celebrating. General George S. Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the architect of the Allied victory. The ornate table between them was a relic of Germany's vanished aristocracy. The mood in the room was not victory, it was tension. Patton hadn't come to toast the end of the war. He'd come to deliver a warning, one that Eisenhower didn't want to hear, one that, Patton knew, would end his career, stain his name in the press, and label him, wrongly, as unstable. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said, his voice low, unflinching. "Let's do it now, while our army is intact, and we can win." He wasn't talking about the Germans. The Wehrmacht was finished. He was talking about the Soviet Union. Eisenhower didn't speak at first. For 3 years, he had balanced the most fragile alliance in modern history, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, to keep the war effort from fracturing. Newspapers back home painted Stalin as Uncle Joe, the scrappy partner who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the West to crush Hitler. Children collected scrap metal for the Red Army. American newsreels praised Soviet heroism. The narrative was set. And here was Patton, the bluntest of America's generals, calmly proposing that the United States turn its guns on its greatest wartime ally. Immediately, decisively, before it was too late. "George," Eisenhower said quietly, "you don't understand politics. The war is over. We're going home." Patton didn't answer right away. He didn't need to, because in that moment, he saw it. Ike knew. Eisenhower understood the threat, maybe not completely, maybe not in the way Patton did, but enough to recognize the truth in the words. And yet, he would do nothing. The political cost was too high. America wouldn't strike first, wouldn't break the alliance, wouldn't act. It was one of the most consequential silences in modern history. In that room, at that table, the last chance to stop Stalin's rise in Europe vanished without a single shot fired. Patton didn't form his conclusions in a briefing room. He didn't need theories or policy memos. He had the Third Army, and it had driven farther into Central Europe than any other American force. From Germany into Czechoslovakia, Patton's tanks had torn through the dying corpse of the Reich, and everywhere they went, they found something worse than German resistance. They found the Red Army. At first, the front was unclear, a foggy, unofficial boundary dividing east and west, drawn more by momentum than diplomacy. But what Patton saw on the Soviet side chilled him. His scouts, officers, and intelligence teams sent back reports that made seasoned combat veterans sit in stunned silence. The Russians weren't acting like allies. They weren't acting like liberators. They were acting like conquerors. Soviet soldiers looted homes, factories, and farms with ruthless efficiency. Whole towns were stripped bare. Machinery, livestock, valuables, tools, even medical equipment, all loaded onto trains bound for the east. Field officers sent dispatches describing what they called state-sanctioned pillage. Worse were the civilian reports. Women violated en masse. Suspected anti-communists shot in the streets. Entire families uprooted and sent to gulags in the east, not because they were Nazis, but because they weren't communists. Patton had seen the horrors of war up close, from North Africa to Normandy to the Ardennes. He wasn't naive. He didn't sentimentalize combat. But this was different. This wasn't the aftermath of battle. It was the beginning of something new, something cold, imperial, and permanent. He wrote home to his wife, Beatrice, in April 1945. "I have no desire to understand the Russians in any sentimental sense. I only want to calculate how many divisions it would take to kill them if it ever becomes necessary." Patton wasn't trying to provoke. He was trying to prepare. Because while diplomats in Washington clung to the belief that Stalin would honor promises of free elections and national sovereignty, Patton was watching those promises dissolve in real time. He met American POWs who had been liberated by Soviet units, and their accounts were worse than anything he'd heard from German camps. They'd had their watches, boots, and rations stolen. Some were beaten. One officer who protested was executed on the spot. Some GIs told Patton to his face they preferred the Wehrmacht to their new Soviet liberators. Across Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, a pattern was emerging. Communist parties, backed by Soviet muscle, were seizing ministries, arresting resistance fighters, purging anyone who had fought the Nazis without Moscow's approval. The Gestapo was gone. The NKVD had taken its place. By the time Germany surrendered, Patton had already made up his mind. He wasn't a loose cannon. He wasn't being reckless. He was acting like what he was, a battlefield commander reading enemy intentions, not from hope, but from hard observation. What he proposed to Eisenhower, and later to Washington, wasn't a tantrum or the ranting of a man who didn't want the war to end. It was a strategic warning, a cold, clear judgment built on reports, facts, and the scars of every town his army rolled through. And what terrified him most was that nobody in power seemed willing to listen. Patton's logic was ruthless and, in his mind, unarguable. The Soviet Union had bled itself to the edge of collapse to defeat Hitler. 27 million dead, cities flattened, farms destroyed, entire regions depopulated. The Red Army had won, but it was exhausted and dangerously overextended. Their divisions in Eastern Europe were strung out over hundreds of miles, camped in broken towns, living off looted supplies and requisitioned food. Their logistics lines stretched all the way back to a homeland in ruins. Rail hubs destroyed, roads cratered, bridges collapsed. Ammunition had to be rationed. Fuel had to be stolen or begged from local puppet governments. It was, Patton believed, a house of cards. The Americans, by contrast, stood at the absolute height of their power. The U.S. Army was fresh, well-fed, and firing on all cylinders. Their tanks were fueled, their rifles cleaned, their morale high. Their supply lines ran back across France to deep-water ports in the Atlantic, feeding an army backed by the most productive industrial machine in human history. They had something else, too. Total air superiority. Fleets of American bombers, B-17s, B-24s, and the new B-29s were ready to fly. In Patton's view, they wouldn't just slow the Red Army. They'd break it. Soviet logistics hubs, rail choke points, river crossings, all could be smashed in days. Without fuel, food, or ammunition, the Red Army would grind to a halt. To Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson, Patton was blunt. We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks. He wasn't guessing. He was calculating, and his numbers were cold. The Soviets had no long-range bombers, no radar coverage worth mentioning, and only scattered anti-aircraft batteries guarding key positions. Their skies, Patton believed, were wide open. Their tanks, mostly T-34s, were formidable in numbers, but worn out from years of constant fighting. Many ran on salvaged parts. Repairs were improvised. Fuel was short. Morale, Patton believed, was even shorter, because now the war was over, and Soviet troops weren't defending Moscow anymore. They were occupying Prague, Bucharest, and Sofia, cities that didn't want them. They were garrisoning foreign capitals, enforcing foreign policies, serving masters they didn't always believe in. And that mattered to Patton, because he understood something politicians in Washington didn't. A tired soldier in someone else's country doesn't fight as hard. Patton believed that if the Americans struck hard and fast, if they surged east with armor and air power, the Soviet front would crack. Not just logistically, psychologically. He predicted mass surrenders, desertions, maybe even outright mutiny. And then came the most dangerous part of his idea, the part no one in Washington dared consider, the part that would later be called madness. We can arm the Germans. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers sat in barbed wire cages, their uniforms stripped, their weapons gone, their futures uncertain. But they were still soldiers, still trained, still bitter, and, Patton argued, still useful. Re-equip them, feed them, point them east. The Soviets would never see it coming. Many of the captured German soldiers loathed the Soviets far more than they hated the Americans. Some had seen what happened in the East. Villages torched, women dragged from their homes, comrades executed in ditches. In Patton's eyes, these men, broken though they were, still had value. They could be rearmed, reofficered, redeployed, pointed east instead of west. I'd rather have a German division in front of me than a Soviet one behind me, Patton told a colleague. Then added, and I'd rather have a German division fighting beside me than a Soviet one anywhere. To Washington, the idea was radioactive. The United States had just lost nearly 500,000 men defeating Nazi Germany. The thought of rearming German troops, even under Allied command, felt like a betrayal of every soldier buried under white crosses from Normandy to Bastogne. But Patton didn't care about symbolism. He cared about outcomes. If Stalin was preparing to carve up Eastern Europe and dominate the continent, Patton argued, why not use Germany's remnants to stop him? Use the tools that already existed. Former enemies could become present-day assets. After all, the Soviets had once been allies of Hitler. The world had already seen how quickly alliances could shift. Within weeks, word of Patton's views began leaking to the press. But the newspapers didn't frame him as a cold-eyed strategist. They painted him as unhinged, a glory-chasing warmonger, a general who admired the Nazis, a man who couldn't let go of combat. Headlines accused him of sympathizing with Germany. Political cartoons mocked his obsession with fighting the next war. Editorials called for his removal. And behind closed doors, Eisenhower was losing patience. Patton had become a problem, not just for Ike, but for Washington. Congress was already demanding demobilization. Families wanted their sons home. Troop transports were being readied. New entanglements in Europe were politically radioactive. The idea of marching on Moscow, of extending the war weeks or months longer, was not just unthinkable, it was impossible. The war is over, Eisenhower told him again. We are going home. And there were practical problems, too. American supply lines had been built to support an occupation, not an invasion. Logistics hubs were staged in France and the Low Countries. Fuel depots, rail lines, ports, all were designed to feed forces stabilizing Germany, not charging into the heart of Poland or beyond. Rearranging that infrastructure would take months, time Patton believed the Soviets would use to entrench. But beneath every excuse, every logistical challenge and public concern, Patton saw the real reason his warning was being ignored. Politics. Harry Truman had taken the oath of office less than a month earlier, still reeling from FDR's death, still finding his footing, still surrounded by Roosevelt's advisors who clung to the dream of post-war cooperation. At Yalta, Stalin had made promises: free elections, national self-determination, peaceful coexistence. Breaking those promises, Patton argued, was already underway. But Truman wasn't ready to admit it. Not publicly. Not yet. To present Patton's plan in that moment, to recommend an attack, would have been political suicide. It would have shredded the fragile post-war order before it even began. It would have painted America, not Stalin, as the aggressor. Eisenhower knew this. And while he respected Patton's instincts, he also understood something deeper. Diplomacy was the only acceptable path forward, even if that path was already beginning to crumble. Like many leaders of the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower still hoped that war had not permanently broken the world. He believed that when the emergency passed, when the guns finally fell silent, the Soviet Union might moderate, that tensions would ease, that the newly formed United Nations might offer a forum where future disputes could be resolved with speeches instead of shells. He thought in terms of diplomacy, institutions, treaties. Patton thought in terms of force, momentum, and opportunity. George sees the world as a battlefield. Eisenhower told his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people. But Patton wasn't entirely alone. Across the English Channel, another man, one with a cigar clenched in his teeth and war in his blood, was reaching the same conclusion. Winston Churchill had never trusted Bolshevism. From the moment of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Churchill saw communism not as a passing political phase, but as a permanent threat to freedom. The only reason he had ever joined forces with Stalin was because Hitler was worse, and only for as long as necessary. Even before the German surrender, Churchill had begun sending increasingly urgent cables to Truman and Eisenhower. He urged them to push as far east as possible before the Red Army locked down the continent. He wanted British and American troops, not Soviet ones, entering cities like Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. On May 12, 1945, Churchill wrote a sentence that would echo through history. An iron curtain has been drawn down upon their front. Behind that curtain, he warned, no one really knew what was happening, but freedom was being strangled. That same month, Churchill ordered his military planners to prepare a bold, deeply unsettling scenario. Operation Unthinkable. The concept was as provocative as its name. An Allied offensive, a surprise attack, launched not at Germany, but at the Soviet Union. The objective: drive the Red Army out of Poland and Eastern Europe using American, British, and, controversially, rearmed German divisions fighting under Allied control. The British chiefs of staff studied the plan carefully. Their conclusions were sobering. It would be a brutal fight. It would demand full mobilization. It might ignite a Third World War. But, and this mattered, it was militarily possible. If launched quickly and decisively, while Western forces still held the initiative, such an operation could succeed. Churchill sent the concept to Truman. The American president took one look and recoiled. The idea of attacking the Soviets, so soon after defeating the Nazis, and with German soldiers fighting under Allied banners, was politically suicidal and morally unbearable. Truman rejected the proposal outright. He would not even entertain the discussion. When Patton learned about Operation Unthinkable, he felt no shock, only a bitter sense of vindication. At least one man in power understands what we're facing, he told his staff. But there would be no Allied push east. No rearmed German battalions. No sudden strike before the Red Army could dig in. Instead, the West stepped back, and the Soviet grip tightened. By the end of that summer, Churchill's worst fears were becoming reality. Elections in Eastern Europe, promised at Yalta, were postponed, rigged, or simply canceled. Opposition leaders were arrested, disappeared, or executed. Resistance fighters who had fought the Nazis were now being hunted by Stalin's secret police. And behind that iron curtain, the free world was already beginning to vanish. By the fall of 1945, the battle for Europe had ended, but the battle for the post-war narrative had just begun. And George S. Patton was losing it. In country after country across Eastern Europe, communist parties, backed by Soviet bayonets and secret police, were seizing control of ministries, courts, police stations, and newspapers. By force or intimidation, freedom was being smothered behind a wall of slogans and silence. But back in the United States, the media's view of Patton was shifting dramatically. During the war, he'd been cast as the Army's hard-edged hero, a fiery, foul-mouthed general who led from the front, slapped sense into cowards, and drove tanks through Nazi lines like a man possessed. The American press had made him a character, the bulldog who chewed bullets for breakfast and made Germans run. But now, with the war over and peace supposedly at hand, the tone changed. Patton's blunt assessments of Soviet aggression, and especially his suggestion that former German units could be rearmed against them, set off a firestorm. Columnist Drew Pearson labeled his remarks deeply troubling, questioning whether the general's judgment was unraveling. Other papers ran editorials warning that Patton was becoming a dangerous anachronism, a relic of war unable to adapt to peace. Magazines openly wondered whether the great battlefield commander had become unfit for public life. Almost no one in the American press investigated the reports that Patton's own intelligence officers were sending back from Eastern Europe: the looting, the executions, the mass arrests, the rigging of elections. No major outlet ran exposés on what the Red Army was really doing behind the front lines. The narrative solidified. Patton had been useful in war. Now he was a problem in peace. The pressure on Eisenhower mounted. The general-turned-politician, soon to be considered for the White House, had no appetite for controversy. Patton's unfiltered honesty, once an asset, had become a liability. Then came the final straw. In August of 1945, Patton was asked at a press conference about the U.S. denazification policy, the Allied effort to purge former Nazi party members from administrative positions across occupied Germany. His response, as always, was unapologetically direct. Most of these officials, Patton said, had joined the Nazi Party out of necessity, not ideology. To remove them all, he argued, was idiotic. If the Allies fired every German with a Nazi Party card, he explained, there would be no one left to run the schools, the power plants, the hospitals. He made a fateful analogy. It's no different than being a Republican or a Democrat in America. The line exploded in the headlines. Context vanished. Nuance was ignored. Patton was accused of equating a genocidal regime with a two-party democracy. Outrage followed. Politicians denounced him. Editorials savaged him. Once again, the facts of post-war Europe were overshadowed by the optics of politics. For Eisenhower, it was the excuse he needed. On September 28, 1945, Dwight D. Eisenhower formally relieved General George S. Patton of his command of the Third Army. Officially, it was because of his remarks on denazification. Unofficially, everyone in Patton's circle understood the truth. He had been removed for speaking too plainly, too persistently, and too publicly about the threat the Soviet Union now posed. He was no longer seen as a strategic thinker, only as a blunt instrument left over from a war the world wanted to forget. Stripped of operational command, Patton did not return home. He remained in Europe, wandering the ruins he'd helped create, watching the world he feared take shape, writing, observing, warning anyone who would still listen. In the final weeks of 1945, George S. Patton no longer commanded an army, but his mind was still on the battlefield. His letters from October and November read like a general's after-action report crossed with a prophet's warning. He wrote to colleagues and Washington officials with the urgency of a man watching history pivot in real time. Stay sharp, he warned. Keep the troops ready. Keep your boots polished and your bayonets sharpened. Patton believed the only way to keep Soviet expansion in check was through visible, unapologetic strength. To him, Moscow respected one thing: force. Not treaties, not handshakes, not goodwill or promises, only the cold certainty of steel. If the United States relaxed now, if it disarmed, if it left Europe too soon, then the victory over Hitler would be hollow. They might have defeated one enemy only to surrender the continent to another. In early December, Patton met once more with Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson. The message was unchanged. The Soviets would not leave Eastern Europe. They would not stop at occupation. They would entrench themselves, build client regimes, and use intimidation, propaganda, and military power to expand westward, step by step, border by border. We are going to fight them eventually, he said again. 5 years, 10, 20. But when that day comes, we'll wish we'd done it in 1945, when we still had the advantage. Patterson listened, respectfully, politely, then gave him the same answer Eisenhower had offered months before. Washington would not act. America was exhausted. The war was over. There would be no new crusade. Whatever Patton saw on the ground, whatever truth his warnings carried, his solution was politically impossible. 3 days later, the warhorse fell. On December 9, 1945, George Patton's staff car was driving near Mannheim, Germany. The roads were clear. The weather was calm. A.U.S. Army trucks suddenly turned across their path. The impact threw Patton forward violently. The man who had survived artillery barges, strafing runs, and tank battles, who had stood upright while bullets cracked overhead, suffered a broken neck in a car crash. The others in the vehicle escaped with minor injuries. Patton was left paralyzed from the shoulders down. He lingered in a hospital bed for 12 days, conscious, unable to move. His body broken, his voice fading. On December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton died at the age of 60. To many, it seemed like cruel irony. To others, a convenient accident. Almost immediately, rumors spread. Some pointed to the army driver's changing story. Others questioned the timing. How the loudest critic of Soviet intentions, a man who had just warned of a coming war, had died days after delivering his final warning to Washington. Was it fate? Coincidence? Or something darker? No proof ever emerged. No conspiracy was ever proven. But the questions have never truly gone away. What is certain is this: the only Allied commander who said plainly what the next war would be, the one man who urged the West to act while it still could, was silenced before the Cold War officially began. History moved on, but Patton's warning remained. No credible evidence of assassination ever surfaced. No secret orders. No hidden hands. Just a wrecked car, a broken neck, and a voice silenced too soon. The sober conclusion remains: it was an accident. But the timing, the symbolism, that was harder to dismiss. Whatever the truth, General George S. Patton was gone. And with him, the loudest voice in the West urging confrontation while the enemy was still weak. In the years that followed, the world watched a pattern unfold. Exactly the pattern he had warned about. By 1946, Soviet control of Eastern Europe was no longer speculative. It was reality. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all behind the curtain. The free elections promised at Yalta? Gone. In Poland, resistance fighters who had spent 6 years battling the Nazis were now hunted by Soviet-backed secret police. Many were executed. Others vanished into gulags, never to return. In Czechoslovakia, 1948 brought a communist coup that ended democracy overnight. Weeks later, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found dead beneath a window at the Foreign Ministry. Official cause, suicide. Unofficial consensus, murder. From capital to capital, the blueprint repeated. The Soviets arrived as liberators. Then came the purges, the party takeovers, the nationalization of property, the rise of secret police, indoctrination, fear. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes across Eastern Europe and the wider Soviet bloc killed an estimated 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or subjected to relentless state repression. The Iron Curtain Churchill warned about? It became literal. Barbed wire, concrete walls, watchtowers, orders to shoot on sight, and the war that Patton had tried to prevent, the one he said would come anyway, just later, and under worse conditions, arrived. The Cold War lasted 45 years. It claimed millions of lives in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. It drained trillions of dollars in arms races and intelligence games. It held the world in a nuclear standoff for decades. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly was over. The age of mutual destruction had begun. By 1950, just 5 years after Patton's death, American troops were once again dying in foreign fields. This time in Korea, facing communist forces backed by Moscow and Beijing. The war he'd warned about had come, just not on his terms. Not with the initiative. Not with the advantage. George S. Patton never claimed the Soviets could be stopped forever. He only argued that May 1945 was the moment, the narrow window, when confronting them would cost the least. But that window had closed, and the world would live with the consequences for nearly half a century. The Red Army was exhausted. Soviet industry was shattered. American power was unmatched, fueled by untouched factories, unrivaled logistics, and a public still galvanized by victory. If a confrontation with Moscow was inevitable, Patton believed it should come when the odds were best. In 1945, when the U.S. held the advantage and the Soviets were vulnerable, overextended, and still reeling from the war. Whether his military calculation was flawless is still debated. But the broader shape of his warning? History would confirm it. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe became a reality for nearly half a century. Communism did not fade. It spread to Asia, Africa, Latin America. And military confrontation with communist forces became a recurring theme of the Cold War, in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, each time at immense cost in blood, treasure, and national unity. By 1947, even the most idealistic Roosevelt-era diplomats began to shift. That year, George F. Kennan, a seasoned U.S. diplomat in Moscow, sent his now famous long telegram. He described the Soviet regime as inherently expansionist, deeply suspicious, and ideologically committed to undermining the West. It was, in academic terms, a polished echo of what Patton had said bluntly in 1945. The Truman Doctrine soon followed, a commitment to contain communism wherever it threatened to spread. But containment came with a price. It accepted the Iron Curtain as permanent. It meant surrendering Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others to Soviet domination. It meant proxy wars, limited wars, wars America could never fully win, all to avoid the global conflict Patton had argued should be fought when it was winnable. It meant decades of Cold War, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Years later, as the Cold War dragged on, conservative thinkers and military historians began to re-examine Patton. To them, he was not a warmonger. He was a prophet. General Douglas MacArthur, who would later clash with Truman in Korea, said that Patton understood communism, and that failing to act on his warning had been a mistake with grave consequences. Ronald Reagan invoked Patton during his own presidency, citing him as a man who saw the moral clarity needed to confront the evil empire. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some pointed back to that quiet room near Frankfurt in May of 1945. What if we had listened to him? What if the confrontation had come then, before the gulags filled, before the proxy wars burned, before the nuclear arms race consumed decades? Could Eastern Europe have been free by 1950 instead of 1990? But that question, like so much in history, has no answer. Because even if Patton was right, his country could not follow him. The United States was tired. Britain was bankrupt. The public, grieving and hopeful, would never have supported another war, especially not against an ally who had just helped defeat Hitler. His plan was militarily bold, but politically impossible. And that was Patton's final tragedy. Not just that he saw the danger, but that he saw it too early. His story leaves behind the same questions every generation must face. When does restraint become appeasement? When should leaders act not for the moment, but for what lies ahead? How do we weigh public will against strategic necessity? And when, if ever, is preemptive war justified? In the spring of 1945, one American general believed he knew the answer. History is still undecided. The same debate echoed after the attacks of September 11th, when American policymakers faced a similar dilemma. Do you strike first, while your enemies are vulnerable? Or do you wait? Hope that diplomacy, engagement, and time will tame ambition? It echoes again now, as America wrestles with the rise of China, its growing military power, and its push for global influence. Patton represents one pole of that argument, the warrior who believes that threats should be crushed early, before they metastasize. Eisenhower in 1945 stood at the other, the coalition builder, the statesman, who put his faith in diplomacy, international institutions, and the patient, grinding machinery of politics. In that sense, Eisenhower's handling of Patton can be read two ways. On one hand, the system worked. A military officer who defied civilian leadership, who spoke outside the chain of command, was relieved of duty, as the Constitution demands. Civilian authority remained supreme. The Republic held. On the other hand, the system failed. A general who had correctly identified an emerging strategic threat, who saw more clearly than the diplomats, journalists, or even his own commander, was silenced because his warnings were inconvenient, politically radioactive, and premature. Eisenhower himself would later admit that in those early post-war years, the West underestimated the depth of Soviet ambition. But he never accepted that Patton's solution, a preemptive strike, had been wise or even realistic. From Ike's perspective, the war was over. The troops were tired. The public wanted peace. Allied promises still hung in the air. Launching a new war against a recent ally would have torn the Western alliance apart, possibly even destroyed the very ideals they had just fought to defend. Patton didn't care. Not about public opinion. Not about political feasibility. He believed in a soldier's duty to recognize danger and destroy it before it grew stronger. That was how he saw the world. That was how he saw history. And that was how he saw his role in it. Not to wait. Not to compromise. But to act. He died on December 21st, 1945, in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, broken, far from the front lines he loved. At his request, he wasn't buried in Arlington or any grand American cemetery. He chose instead to lie among the men of the Third Army, in a simple grave in Luxembourg, beside the soldiers he had commanded, fought beside, and bled with. In death, George S. Patton became something more than a general. He became a symbol, a blank flag onto which America projected its deepest divisions. To conservatives, he embodied courage, clarity, the iron will to confront evil before it metastasized. To liberals, he was the embodiment of unchecked militarism, the man too quick to reach for his pistol when diplomacy faltered. To the American public, he was the fiery tank commander who had helped break Hitler's spine. The question of whether he was right about the Soviet Union was not answered by debate. It was answered by history, by the decades of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, by the barbed wire and prison states behind the Iron Curtain, by the global spread of communism, and by the Cold War that shaped the second half of the 20th century. Whether Patton's proposed solution would have stopped that history, or simply plunged the world into something worse, we will never know. What we do know is this. In the spring of 1945, when the world was celebrating peace, Patton saw a different storm gathering on the horizon. He spoke about it, loudly, bluntly, and he paid for it, with his reputation, his command, and possibly his life. The men who silenced him, the politicians, the generals, the journalists, spent the next 45 years trying to manage the world he warned was coming. His voice still echoes, a warning in uniform, a prophet in a steel helmet, a reminder that sometimes the person who sees most clearly is the one most quickly dismissed as extreme, unstable, or unhinged. Sometimes the truth-teller is labeled dangerous. The warrior who points to the next threat is told to stand down. And the man who refuses to celebrate victory is the only one willing to see that the next war has already begun. Mason,